Start then. Well, thanks very much, everybody, for coming along. People that have been to leaving dues at the County Council over a number of years might remember when I introduced a thing for colleagues retiring, where they would come along and do a presentation. James, could you put your camera off, please, or you'll be recorded for posterity? Where people would come along and give a presentation on their career, on the observations of the changes that they've seen in local government. So having seen some splendid ones from the likes of Keith Wade and David Polk, and I think Jerry Hindle might have done one, it sort of caught on. I thought, well, I'm going to do one of those myself. So first of all, I'd like to apologise for the fact that we're not in person and we're not going to get a bit of a booze up afterwards, but it's not that difficult to work out when it's appropriate to have a party, is it? Well, I managed it anyway. So we're going to have to do it on Teams. And the other thing that I'd just like to say from the outset is that one of the things that I'm absolutely certain about is that everything that I'm going to talk about has been achieved by large numbers of people. And I just didn't know where to start if I started naming people. It would begin to turn into the Oscars. So I think I might name a few of the retired guests, but I don't plan to name any of the people that are still with the authority. Anyway, let's get started. Now, first of all, I want to take the advice of Andrea Hill, our former chief executive. I remember her once saying in a management seminar that we should be more authentic and bring more of ourselves to work. And I remember lurking at the back, which I always thought was quite a safe place to be when Andrea Hill was speaking, and thinking, I'm not sure that's a very good idea. But with a week to go, I've decided it's worth the risk. And I'm going to have to pause the presentation there to welcome Michael Wilkes, who's joined us from the United States of America. Welcome, Michael. Everyone's got their cameras off because we're recording the event. So if we could move to the next slide, please. I'm actually starting before even my local government career kicks in. In 1961, I was born in a place called Hatfield in South Yorkshire. And I came from a family of miners. Virtually everybody in my grandfather's generation were miners. And this is a memorial to the pit where they all worked. And along the bottom, it has some words that when I went to see this in the summer, when I was coming back from my holiday, really spoke to me. It says, "We stand on the shoulders of giants." And I'll tell you what, in terms of what I've achieved in local government and achieved in my life, I can't think of a truer statement. Ben Jones, my grandfather, was my giant and the father figure in my life. And everything that I have achieved, for better or worse, I think he had a big part in. He also instilled in me a sort of way of approaching life, where he said that you're as good as anybody, he used to say to all his grandchildren, but you're not better than other people. And I think that was a really good sort of rule for me to take into life. And it certainly helped me when my first memorable engagement with local government occurred in 1972, when I failed my 11 plus, my first interaction with local government. And so I ended up going to Saddleworth Secondary Modern. And I don't know if lots of people on the call probably don't remember the grammar school system or the secondary modern system, but I was dispatched to Saddleworth Secondary Modern, the sort of the end of the road for academic education and for professional jobs. But at the age of 16, I had another interaction with local government and the public sector. I struck lucky in 1977. There was an education minister called Shirley Williams, who was a reforming education minister, and she was driving comprehensive schooling through education. So suddenly at the age of 16, my secondary modern, where I'd been dispatched as an 11 plus failure, turned into a comprehensive school. And I had another one of these local government moments. We talk teaching and education is very important to our council. And I remember a series of adverts a few years ago to attract people to the teaching profession about teachers that changed your life. And in 1977, when I started those final years, I had a form teacher called Mr. Reynolds, who was an inspiring public servant, inspiring teacher. And for some reason, he got it into his head that I could succeed and really encouraged me. And as a result of that, I managed to extricate myself from the secondary modern, and I was off to the sixth form. Could we have the next picture, please? And the next picture is the picture of my school in Oldham Comprehensive. This was a fantastic institution as far as I was concerned, because this comprehensive school gave me the gateway into the career that I was later to have. And it was a wonderful place, and there were some wonderful teachers. And in 90, you can see it, that's looking out over Greater Manchester. I think a lot of those mill stacks have gone. Any Ipswich Town fans that have visited Oldham Athletic will know this area, because just to the right of the school is the Boundary Park football ground. Well, anyway, because of the success of the comprehensive system introduced in the latter part of my school education, I was off to university in 1980. So let's see what happened at university in 1980. Let's have a look at the next picture. So my granddad, instilling this confidence into me that I was as good as anyone, had done a good job, because here I am at Sussex University in 1983. I think the first thing you'll observe is the absolutely appalling dress sense. You know, I was supposed to be in my youthful prime at this point, but God almighty, I look like man at millets in that. Anyway, by this point, I was the editor of the student newspaper. And so I'd got an early eye for communications issues. I've managed to get myself elected. It's still black and white in those days, Tim's right. I'd managed to get myself self-elected as the Vice President of Communications, and I was the editor of the student newspaper. Well, anyway, after a few years at Sussex University, I emerged with an economics degree. So let's have a look how that went. It was actually what we called a Desmond, in memory of Desmond Tutu, the South African leader. So it wasn't a particularly good degree, it was a Tutu. But I emerged, and as you can see in the picture here, with a degree in the summer of 1984. And my eye for communications and my grandfather's featuring again here, isn't he, with my placard here. I'm stood alongside three Kent miners who I worked very closely with during the miners' strike, with my placard, pit closures, graduates jobless, one struggle. And that was featured on the front page of the local paper on the day of my graduation. And it also, in the middle of the great miners' strike of the 1980s, featured in the miners' newspaper, the Miner. And my grandfather, I don't know what possessed me actually. I should have got him into that picture alongside myself and the miners, but he's looking on proudly out of picture. Anyway, let's see what happens next. So I leave, in the next picture, I've left university now, and I'm throwing myself into supporting my grandfather's community in the miners' strike. And here I am speaking at a public meeting, and I tried this out on some colleagues earlier on that were a bit younger than me, and they hadn't the faintest idea of who the two young blokes with beards are. I hope some of you can recognise them. Just in case, the colleagues I spoke to earlier on weren't atypical. The seated young man is myself speaking at the public meeting, and the standing young man is a backbench MP who's just entered Parliament, who went on to be the leader of the opposition. Of course, it's Jeremy Corbyn, who at that point was barely more known than me. The television camera in the background isn't there for either of us. It was because next up was going to be Tony Benn speaking on the miners' strike. Anyway, you'll be relieved to know that the preamble of my early life is now over, and we're going to start my career in local government. So let's have a look at the next picture. So some of you might recognise that as the London Aquarium and a hotel opposite the Houses of Parliament. But in November 1985, when I started my local government career, it was the seat of London government. It was the offices of the Greater London Council. And my first job was I was a personal assistant, a PA, in what was called the Programme Office. And Ken Livingstone had just been elected as the leader of the GLC. And the job of my boss, a guy called Reg Race, was to take Ken Livingstone's manifesto. And I learned so much in this office about how local government really works. His job was to transform the manifesto, his programme, if you like, into a whole series of detailed objectives, break it down, turn it into objectives, and then allocate this huge organisation's budgets to each of the objectives, set performance targets, and identify a senior officer who would be held accountable for making each objective happen. So that was the first time I'd been involved in a business plan, but it was if you like, the mother of all business plans, because it was a business plan for the biggest local government organisation in the country at the time. So it was an exciting place to work. I actually met, some people might remember Simon White, who was our Director of Children and Young People for a period and was the interim chief executive, I think, for a short period. I met him working alongside him in that office. He had a more senior role than me. I was the new kid on the block. But my first job in local government ended badly. So let's have a look what happens on the next slide. Unfortunately, my career in local government nearly came to a bit of a sort of early end, because the big policy of the Greater London Council, my first employer, was what was called the Fares Fair policy. For the benefit of my colleagues in GHI, it was like the bus back better on steroids. It was inspired by a place called Bologna in Italy, where they actually introduced free transport. It didn't go that far, but the idea was across rail, tubes and buses, there was a massive reduction in fares, which meant that young people could travel across the city. Congestion was reduced because people were beginning to use the buses more. And it was a hugely popular policy, except with some. Bromley Council challenged the policy in court in the context of the Transport London Act 1969. And the man in the silly hat, if you're wondering who he is Lord Denning. And he was the law lord that heard the case. And he ruled that the Transport London Act 1969, because it said that transport had to be run by the Greater London Council in an integrated, efficient and economic way, that it was illegal, because in his view, economics simply meant like a business. So if it was heavily subsidised through the business rates, it couldn't be economic, and it was declared illegal. I remember at the time, Dr. Stephen Glaister and Professor Michael Beasley took a rather wider view of what economic meant. They thought it meant something like the impact on the economic life of the city, whether it made the city work effectively, whether it made the city work for its community. But old Lord Denning in his silly hat took a different view, declared it illegal. So the second picture on the slide is the campaign to keep fares fair when it was declared illegal, announcing, these posters were up across London, saying that there was a 100% increase and it was coming from Westminster. And then people asked, well, if the Greater London Council signature policy has gone down the pan, does that mean the GLC is finished? Well, the answer was not quite, but Prime Minister Thatcher made sure it was. She then decided to go the whole hog and abolish my first employer. And 74% of Londoners surveyed said that was a very bad idea. They liked the, yes, Reg Race became the chief executive of Derby County Council. I remember him getting that job. And so 74% said no to the abolition of my first employer. Margaret Thatcher said yes, and it was abolished. So what happens then? In 1986, I get another job. I go to the London Strategic Policy Unit. So let's see what happens there. My next slide. Now, what I was responsible for was responding to the Local Government Act 1988. The bit that I was particularly responsible for was the London Strategic Policy Unit was created by all the boroughs in London clubbing together to keep on some of the GLC staff expertise so they could advise the whole of London. And my job was to advise them on the introduction of compulsory competitive tendering. So you're wondering, what's clause 28? Well, clause 28 was the other bit of the Local Government Act 1988 that was probably the most awful piece of local government legislation, certainly in my lifetime, possibly ever. It banned schools from teaching the acceptability, this is quoting from the Act, of homosexuality as a pretended relationship. That meant that in schools, because of this Act in 1988, it was illegal to teach a child of gay parents or lesbian parents that was okay. And I think that, and if you want to know that story, can I really recommend a series that you might have missed? It's called It's a Sin, and it was on Channel 4. I really recommend that you have a look at that. But haven't we come a long way? We've got on LGBTQ Day, we have the rainbow flag flying above our Endeavour House, and we've worked with Stonewall to make sure that our employment practices take into account the need for equality. And I'm really pleased that awful piece of legislation was taken off the statute book. Anyway, so I'm working on the Local Government 1988, but unfortunately for me, due to rate capping, the decision by all the London boroughs to fund this London Strategic Policy Unit put their budgets under too much pressure. So my second local government employer was promptly abolished, another setback. But then I got myself a job in 1988 working for Hackney. Now, instead of just developing policy about how to respond to compulsory competitive tendering in 1988, I was now going to a London borough to actually do it, to make it happen. And so one of the services that I was responsible for was the tendering of estate cleaning of all the council estates in Hackney. And so when I started, I think his name was David Huber, my first boss, said, well, go along to a housing committee and you can see how the council's run. So let's see how my first housing committee went in the next picture. It didn't go like the typical council committee meeting. Unbeknown to me, the first council committee meeting that I ever attended in my career was the housing committee, as then was Hackney Council, was considering a policy to evict hundreds of squatters who'd moved into unoccupied council flats so that they could be refurbished. It was a very controversial policy because the squatters had been there for many years. So as the meeting started, the squatters started climbing out of the public gallery and running towards Councillor Brynley Heaven, who was the chair of the committee. At this point, I thought, oh gosh, I suppose I ought to do something here. So I jumped to my feet with another officer who was present, a guy called Keith Burness. You remember these moments well when they happen. And I put myself between the committee chair, the chairperson, because Labour authority, of the housing committee and the squatters. And between us, we managed to talk the squatters down, calm things down. The housing committee chairman wasn't punched. It was a close thing, but he wasn't punched, which pleased everybody. And when the police arrived, they were just quietly escorted from the meeting, and a real scene was avoided. So that was my first council committee meeting. My next stop is Islington. So let's see what happens there. Let's look at the next picture. You're probably wondering why there's a picture of the Arsenal Emirates Stadium there. Well, there's a story behind that, which I'll come to in a moment. At this council, I was responsible for now not only blue collar compulsory competitive tendering of all the manual services being forced to put out their services to tender, but also the white collar service as well, the professional services, the property service, HR, finance, and so on, and even legal. And I remember it was quite interesting at the time that there was a lot of senior officers in the white collar services that had thought compulsory competitive tendering of work was a really good idea. Then suddenly, when they were exposed to compulsory competitive tendering, you could see them thinking, well, maybe it wasn't such the good idea that they thought it was going to be. My job, I've worked for authorities of all political colours. My job at that time was to support the Labour Authority to make sure that all the services stayed in-house. And I achieved this through working with them on business plans and preparation for tendering and supporting them through the procurement process in every case except one. And this is where we come to the Emirates Stadium. We had a depot that was in terrible disrepair. It was in danger of becoming unsafe, where the vehicle maintenance service was based, but also the refuse collection service. And we came up with this idea that if we could let an extremely long vehicle maintenance contract, we could get the private company to come in and pay for the refurbishment of the depot as part of the deal. And the site for this depot was Ashburton Grove. Now, Arsenal fans might remember that Ashburton Grove was the place where the Arsenal bought some land to build this stadium. So the depot that my first public-private partnership I was involved in, lies in the rubble, in the foundations of the Emirates Stadium. Anyway, so that's Islington Council sorted out. Let's move on in 1998, where I become a best value consultant and moved to Newham. Now, what had happened in this period was that Prime Minister Blair had been elected, and his policy was that he was not going to have compulsory competitive tendering in the way that it had been under the previous government. He was going to introduce something called best value. And the idea behind best value was that you worked through what was called the 4 C's. Some of the people on the call might remember them. We had to challenge the way each service was run. Was it the right service? Were we doing the right thing? Was this service needed anymore? We had to compare it across the public and private sector to find people that were doing it better. And then we had to consult the public to see what they want. And then the 4th C, with, I would say, a bit more balanced than when it was just compulsory competitive tendering, an assumption that was private was best. Then competition had to be used when appropriate. I was still only 37 when I plunged into this job, and I got it's on a 2-year fixed year contract, and people thought I was a bit mad, but I thought that if I got this job, it would open up all sorts of opportunities. And it certainly did, because in 1999, looking at the picture, you'll have noticed that we got the best value core team got the local government management team of the year. Now, I appear in that picture on near the bottom left, but in that picture, it's quite a sort of roll of honour. You've got Wendy Thompson, who went on to be the head of public service reform in Blair's cabinet. More recently, she was for a period the Norfolk County Council executive. We've got Leo Boland just beneath her on the right. He went on to be Boris Johnson's City Hall chief at the Greater London Authority, and 2 more people in this picture got to be chief executives later in their careers. So it was absolutely terrifying working on this team so early in my career, but I learned a huge amount, reviewed service after service, and I think it put me in good stead to having a really sort of challenging approach to services that's helped me throughout my career. And then back in the summer of 2000, the GLC wasn't recreated, but the Greater London Authority was. So in the summer of 2000, I get a job as the head of best value at the Greater London Authority. So I've now got the job of introducing best value to all the services that are influenced by the Greater London Authority. So let's see how that went in the next slide. So Ken Livingstone's back. He starts his first GLA meeting by saying, referring to the earlier abolition, before I was rudely interrupted, and then he opened the meeting. And so I was trying to work out, how on earth am I going to introduce best value to the GLA? Part of the problem was that the GLA isn't a service delivery body as such. It's a strategic authority that sits above what were called the functional bodies, and still are, the Metropolitan Police Authority, the Fire and Emergency Planning Authority, and the Development Agency, all these functional bodies. And I was trying to work out, well, how do you make best value work in that? And one of the things I spotted in the legislation was that the GLA, the Great London Authority, had to produce an annual report and a best value performance plan. So, and I knew that the summary of a best value performance plan at that time had to be sent to every household. So I went to see the political advisors in the mayor's office and said, if we combine the annual report with the best value performance plan, you can send a summary of it, setting out the mayor's agenda to every household in London. And they thought that was a splendid idea. So my first big project in 2001 was to produce Mayor Livingstone's first annual report. It was like trying to herd cats to get all these functional bodies to agree the wording, and it needed some heavy persuasion from the mayor's office and pointing out that the mayor set their budget to get them all to agree to do it. But do it they did. And my funny story from this is I turned up at Mayor Livingstone's cabinet meeting to present my report on the best value performance plan and the annual report. And he said, very, very good. And I said, have you got any questions? He says, Mr. Griffiths, any questions that you'd like to ask, any guidance? I said, yeah, I've got one question, Mayor Livingstone. What do you think I should put on the front page? And he went, well, Mr. Griffiths, if you think very hard, I'm sure you'll work it out. So I applied all my political acumen and worked it out and put his face on the front page. The other picture, you might have noticed Helen Mirren. And that was because I thought, well, best value performance plans can be a bit dry. So I went to see the comms office and said, we've got to make this, more interesting so that when Londoners get it through their door, they are interested. So the comms office came up with Helen Mirren meets Ken Livingstone on the sofa in interview, and that's featured in this best value performance plan summary. Best value performance plan summaries were generally dull as dishwater, but this one caused a hell of a stir, was covered in all the tabloid press who were outraged about the interview with Helen Mirren being pushed through everybody's door. But it endeared me to the mayor's office. But anyway, it wasn't long before I spotted another opportunity back in Newham. So let's go back to Newham in the next slide. So what happened in Newham was I mentioned these council committees that I went to at the very start of my career. Well, at this point, there was a new piece of legislation that introduced executive government, the cabinet or mayoral form of government. And Robin Wales, who was the leader of Newham Council, persuaded the council that they should go for the mayoral model, which is effectively, it combines, you've seen it in some of the northern authorities today, it's the same legislation. You combine the mayor and the chief executive almost in one, but the mayor was persuaded, Mayor Wales was persuaded that it would be a good idea if he at least made it look that there was an effective scrutiny function. So they decided that they'd create a chief officer, and I got the role and got to review all sorts of different services. But the most interesting one, with the benefit of hindsight, was the health scrutiny that I did. I employed a bloke called Professor Harrow, who wanted to, because the local health authorities wanted to look at why there was a greater incidence of tuberculosis in Newham than other countries. Well, anyway, the review that we carried out established that, against the popular opinion that was in the press at the time, that was the racist opinion that it was all to do with immigrants, the cause of the greater incidence of TB was poverty, poor diet, overcrowding, and poor housing. Basic public health messages. Haven't we heard them a lot over the last year and a half? You know, the same places like Newham having the biggest incidence of COVID. And God, if we could learn those lessons in the early part of this century, why it wasn't local government empowered to do the things that needed to be done to address public health? It's great that public health has been brought back into the heart of local government, but we need more resources to challenge the health problems. And it's not just about the health service, it's about poverty, poor diet, overcrowding and poor housing. And then in 2003, I left Newham again, and this time I was off to Suffolk. And I found out later that the consultants, the headhunters that oversaw the process, characterised my candidature for the Assistant Director of Environment as the high risk, high reward candidate. And I asked them what on earth they meant. I liked the high reward. I wasn't sure about the high risk. And what they meant was that because of the range of things that I'd done with politicians at the GLA, with best value, with procurement, I had a good raft of all the core skills. But the risk bit was I'd never, ever managed a single service that I was going to be responsible for. So let's have a look how it started in Suffolk in the next picture. So this was probably the finest hour that I've had in Suffolk. And what you see in the picture is the opening of one of the biggest projects that I've ever been involved in, the Suffolk Energy from Waste plant at Great Blakenham. And I think one thing that I've learned in my career that I hope people can take away from what I've got to say, younger people setting out on their career, is it takes a big team to deliver a big project. It's not about the senior manager that's in charge. It's about all the people that get involved in a project. And I think this photo for me sums up what that means. There's councillors here, there's parish councillors, there's people from the Suffolk Waste Partnership, couple of key people. You can see Councillor Eddie Alcock, who I attended many parish council meetings. He dubbed us, he was quite a short bloke, I got on very well with him. He dubbed it as the little and large act when we turned up at parish councils. He always said that to see if he could endear himself to the parish council. Didn't always work because they weren't necessarily persuaded of the virtue of the Energy from Waste plan. And then there's Lisa Chambers, another councillor who I worked with at the latter part of the process. And there's some key officers. And I said I wasn't going to mention the ones that are still here, but I must mention some of the people that have left the authority that are in this picture. There's David Polk, the head of planning. And why is David important? Well, I'll tell you why, is if you don't sort out the planning framework, if you want to deliver a waste infrastructure project like this, it doesn't happen. Look over the border at Norfolk, where their Energy from Waste project went well and truly down the pan. That's because they hadn't sorted out the waste local plan. I worked with David Polk, who taught me, along with John Pitchford, everything that I've picked up about planning, and he was instrumental to making sure that project was a success. There's also in the picture Lucy Robinson, my wonderful director, one thing that characterised Lucy Robinson, who was the director for the longest period of my career, was that she was so good at delegation and trusting you and empowering you to get on with the job. And she was a wonderful director, and I'm sure a lot of people on the call remember her. And then also in the picture, there's Clive Longdon, who I think is here today. Like anybody who's seen me trying to handle a spreadsheet will know the importance of me when I'm delivering a big project, having a finance supremo on the team. And Clive Longdon was certainly that. So what I've got to say about this is when you're delivering a big project, it's not about me. It's not about the senior manager. It's team. But I must come to my favourite photo from this project now. We'll look at the next one. This is myself and the fantastic David Gaisley, who was the project director for the Energy from Waste project. He was more responsible than anyone for delivering this project. And this is my second local government Chronicle Awards ceremony, where we're the public-private partnership of the year. It has to be said that by this point of the evening, we were completely hammered, and it shows. But we were celebrating that over 25 years, the Energy from Waste plant is going to save Suffolk 350 million quid. And Jeff Dobson took the budget of the waste service when it opened down from 29 million to 19 million. So we've got a lot to celebrate now. And I was absolutely crap at football at school. So that's the only trophy that I've got to fling around in my life. Unfortunately, if you look at the top on the left, there's what looks like a dent, and it is a dent, because we did get a bit hammered at the celebration do, and I dropped it on the way back to the tube. So if you go to the trophy cabinet in Endeavour House and take a close look at it, there's quite a big dent where it got dropped on the way back, but we didn't care. We had a great night. So let's have a look at another project. Let's look at the next picture. The West Suffolk Operational Hub. One of the things when we built the Energy from Waste plant we had to do was to get waste from all the four corners of Suffolk and take it to the Energy from Waste plant, which meant that you had to have a transfer station where all the refuse trucks go, dump their waste, it's bulked up, put onto big bulkers and taken to the Energy from Waste plant. And we came up with the idea that wouldn't it be a good idea if we combined the transfer station with our recycling centre and worked closely with the district council to include their depot as well. And it was a tremendous project. It reduced transport miles, which is great for climate change. It reduced costs in the long term. It improved the provision of a recycling centre, and we could even introduce a fantastic new reuse centre where people could buy some of the stuff rather than recycling it. We could take it into the shop and people could buy the stuff. But unfortunately, we'd chosen one of the poshest bits of Bury, and so there was one hell of a campaign mobilised against it. They even got their own car with its special livery, as you can see in this. You can see all their posters: waste hub tip, no thank you, and have your say before it's too late. And this all culminated, this planning process, in a meeting one Friday night where myself and a heroic Mark Walsh from St Edmundsbury Borough Council were on the platform of a rather large hall in Bury for 2 hours on a Friday night, facing 200 people questioning us non-stop. Well, I'd like to think we won the argument. We certainly won the vote at the committee, and the West Suffolk Operational Hub is finished and built and is there today. So another infrastructure project. So let's go on to the next infrastructure project. This one's a bit different. Oh, what Mark Walsh has just said, he still has nightmares, Bryn. I drank a lot after that one to get over it. I was completely traumatized by the experience. So anyway, the next project, I wasn't actually responsible for delivering the housing in Chiltern Woods. My role was to work with the district council to get this site, which was an old county farm, into their local plan so it could be rolled out for housing. And the idea was we supported the district in delivering their local plan responsibilities, and we also made sure that there was a good proportion of affordable rent and shared ownership. So as a result of this project, 1,150 new homes are going to be built. The project is just starting as we speak. TW bought the site, and around about a quarter will be affordable, which is really good. And we brought in, I must say, thanks to Concertus, our local authority company, who delivered this project and did a fantastic job. And I'm pleased to say that we got a £35 million capital receipt for it, which was rather helpful when you come to the next slide, because I was responsible for the Lake Lothing third crossing. I've just seen somebody, Michael from the Safety of the United States, was just messaging about the Upper Orwell crossings. That was the project that I had to assist in closing down because there wasn't the budget to deliver it. This project was very helpful because it helped pay for the other bridge project. Let's have a look at the next slide. The third crossing, we've got it up. Back one. This was the most difficult project of my career. I think that it was difficult from the start. The project was to build a bridge across a port, an active port. We had a contractor involved in the design process that put in a bid to build it that was absolutely unrealistic. We had a COVID outbreak in the middle of the procurement process, the biggest health crisis since the First World War. The project was pretty much underfunded by the Department for Transport. The budget envelope we could apply for was too small from the start. We were disrupted by a general election in the middle of the planning process, which delayed the planning process. And then when they came back from the general election, the Prime Minister sacked the minister responsible for making the decision, causing more delay. And then just when I thought it couldn't get worse, the project director left. And all this time we were driven by an ill-advised timetable that had been driven by Prime Minister Cameron's promise that we would have it done by the next general election. Now, I'm not going to say it was easy. Some of the relationships I had with politicians in the informal cabinet were a bit feisty, but I've decided I'm going to be positive today. So I'm going to adopt what I call the stag night principle. I've never been unfortunate enough to go on a proper drunken stag night, but I understand the rule is that what happens on the stag night stays in the stag night. So I'm applying today to my discussions with the informal cabinet, the stag night principle. What happened in the informal cabinet will forever stay in the informal cabinet. But I'm delighted that the outcome of the cabinet meeting when it eventually happened was that up to £145 million was allocated for the delivery of the bridge. And we had the final board meeting of the it's Gullwing now. It says Lake Lothing Third Crossing on this old picture with me in it. But we had the final meeting of the Gullwing board meeting, and I'll repeat what I said them today. When you listen to that litany of hurdles and challenges that this project faced, it is a huge tribute to that team that they've got to the point where you can see this beautiful bridge slowly emerging from the ground. It's a huge tribute to them, and I think it's public service at its best. And I can't say thank you enough for every single member of that team that supported this project. You did a fantastic job. You've had a lot of stick. You deserve a lot of credit. Let's move on to my final project, my final hurrah. And what a hurrah it was. We were given the task by members. They said that they wanted to see a nuclear power station at Sizewell, but it had to be the right kind of development. It had to work for Suffolk. So we were given the challenge of being critical supporters, but delivering improvements throughout the consultation process and throughout the examining authorities' hearings. And I think let's look at what happened in the end game. That there's a team. We were having a learning lesson. Learning the lessons from the Sizewell project with around 30 officers on a call with the lawyers this afternoon to make sure that the corporate memory of what we have achieved in the Sizewell C planning process is properly remembered. And we were talking today, it was reported to them that around £200 million, depending on what happens with some of the contingent funds, but around £200 million was secured for Suffolk. And I think this is another team, and it's not just the core team in GHI, but the team across the whole authority, the 30 odd officers, but also the non-governmental organisations we worked with, the parish councils, the district council, and I'd say credit to the campaigners that were opposed to the development as well. They helped shift the agenda as well. And as a result, we secured this £200 million. I'm personally, as somebody who came into this authority as Assistant Director of Environment, particularly delighted that we secured around 90 million for the environment. That's a sort of fantastic opportunity. People might have different views about Sizewell C. I know some of the councillors are opposed to the development on principle, but the fact that we've got 90 million for the environment is fantastic. We were told during the consultation that there was no need for a link road to get from to avoid congestion on the B1122. We've got the Sizewell link road. We were told we wanted a 4-village bypass, but we were told there could be no village bypass, and we got a 2-village bypass. Even when EDF put in their application to the planning inspectorate, we were told that there was no way that there could be greater use of rail and sea, but we soldiered on, and as a result there was a substantial reduction in the number of lorries on our rural and county roads as a result of the representations we made and others made. And I think that, what a team. You achieved what was regarded by many to be impossible. And to cite a phrase coined at an earlier stage in the project, this was most definitely an ambitious officer team. And let's move to the next slide. So I've told you about the small role that I've had in local government over the last 36 years. If you look back in local government, around public health and sanitation and housing, local government has played a fantastic role for this country. It might have been undermined by centralising forces, abolishing councils, rate capping, stymieing local government's ability to make its own financial choices. I'd have loved to have worked in a local government that had greater regional authority like they have in Germany. But I've been proud to play my small part in what was possible. What was possible was limited far more than it should have been. But I think in Suffolk, the teams that I've worked with can be proud of what they achieved. So the end, I started off as Assistant Director of Environment. And I think that what is the biggest challenge facing local government? Well, I've put a picture of me with Chris Packham. Nick Collinson introduced me to him. And he's been exemplary in making sure that truth is spoken to power about what we need to do on climate change. And I think that if there's something that local government's got to do in the next period that dwarfs everything else that local government's got to do in the next period, it is to play its part in tackling climate change. So I hope that all my former colleagues will help rise to that challenge. And I don't just mean in Suffolk, I mean across local government, because it's going to be one hell of a challenge for our children and the people that go after us, but it's got to be done. So it's goodbye from me.